Freedom is not the removal of structure, but the restoration of direct relationship with what is real. Gentlemen, this must be the foundation.
For this deep dive, we are looking at a diagnostic image of a very different kind.
Oh, absolutely.
Not of a human body, but of the modern democratic state itself. And the image we have in our source materials today is honestly one of the most visually striking metaphors I have seen in a long time.
It really is. It sticks with you.
It does. It's this visual representation of a profound crisis. So if you can, picture this in your mind to you listening right now. On the left side of this image, you see a massive pane of glass that is literally shattering.
Just exploding.
Yeah, you can almost feel the kinetic energy of it. It's jagged, chaotic shards exploding outward into the dark. And overlaid on that destruction in these stark letters are three words: relativism, fragmentation, collapse.
It is an incredibly visceral image. Like, you don't just see it, you almost flinch. You can practically hear the glass breaking.
You really can. But then your eye moves to the right side of the frame, and it is the exact polar opposite. Juxtaposed right against that shattering glass is this solid, structurally flawless, glowing golden pyramid.
It's got these intricate geometrical lines, deep, immovable foundations, and just this aura of complete permanence.
Yes. And the label carved into this pyramid is ordered liberty.
The contrast there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The shattered glass of relativism versus the grounded, intentional architecture of ordered liberty. That visual is basically the entire thesis of everything we are exploring today.
It really is the perfect map for our journey today. So to you, the listener, welcome to today's deep dive. If you are someone who studies political theory, or if you're a law student buried in constitutional jurisprudence, or honestly, if you're just insanely curious about why our current civic life feels like it's fraying at the edges and constantly vibrating with anxiety.
Which is a lot of us right now.
Right, which is most of us. Well, today is an absolute masterclass. We're spending this time unpacking a massive, incredibly ambitious 2025 white paper by Jamie Vincent Thornberry. It's titled Ordered Liberty.
And we are specifically diving into the revised and expanded editions here. What Thornberry is attempting to do in this paper is genuinely monumental.
It's a huge swing.
It really is. He is trying to engineer a system that unifies objective moral truth with a viable, pluralistic civic order. Basically, he's trying to figure out how people who fundamentally disagree can somehow still share a functional moral society.
And the central premise, the core diagnosis of this deep dive is that the crisis of the modern democratic state is not actually a political crisis.
Right.
It's not just a string of bad policy decisions or, the wrong people getting elected or a broken tax code. It is an ontological crisis.
And that is a word we are definitely going to have to spend some real time on.
We absolutely will.
Yeah.
But the short version is that modern governments, according to this framework, are desperately trying to sustain human dignity without acknowledging the underlying reality that gives dignity its actual meaning.
They want the fruit, but they are chopping down the tree. Thornberry frames the problem so acutely. He basically argues that when you have rights without reality, those rights eventually just become preferences.
Wow.
Yeah. And when you champion tolerance but strip away truth, that tolerance mutates into this inability to distinguish human flourishing from human degradation.
It's like we lose the compass entirely.
Exactly. He argues that the modern liberal order is essentially running on fumes. We are coasting on the moral inheritance of previous generations, trying to keep all the benefits of a moral universe while aggressively sawing off the branch we're sitting on.
There is a direct quote from the paper that literally gave me chills. He calls it a slow surrender dressed in the vocabulary of fairness.
That is such a good line.
So good. So our mission today is to unpack this golden pyramid. We're going to explore its foundational layers. We're going to understand how it proposes to govern highly diverse populations without becoming a tyranny, which is a neat trick.
Very difficult.
Right. And we'll test its structural integrity with real-world constitutional tests.
But before we lay the first brick here, we need to make one thing explicitly clear to you, the listener.
Yes, the disclaimer. We have to do the disclaimer.
We too. As we navigate this incredibly detailed framework today, we are acting purely as impartial guides. Thornberry makes some very specific, sweeping structural claims about the nature of truth, the definition of the good, and the mechanics of evil.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy. And our role here is not to endorse the political, philosophical, or theological viewpoints contained in this white paper.
Right.
We aren't here to tell you Thornberry is right or wrong. Our goal is simply to unpack the architecture of his proposed system so you can understand how it's engineered, what historical problems it aims to solve, and how it challenges modern assumptions.
Basically, we are just reading the blueprints.
Perfectly said. We are the architects rolling out the blueprints on the table, putting on our reading glasses, and pointing out where the load-bearing walls are.
I love that. So let's start at the absolute bottom. Let's look at the bedrock of that golden pyramid.
Into that foundation.
Right. The foundational premise of this entire framework is that truth is real, it is objective, and it is grounded in the structure of being itself.
And critically, that truth is not constructed by consensus.
Mm-hmm.
It is not negotiated in a parliament, and it is absolutely not established by a majority vote.
Okay, I want to pause right here because we threw around the phrase ontological crisis earlier, and we need to translate that. Ontological is a very heavy $10 philosophy word.
Is.
So let's break that down for the listener, and honestly, for me. What does he actually mean by ontological?
It is a heavy word, but it's crucial for this. Ontology is the philosophical study of being. It's the study of what is the nature of reality itself.
Okay.
So when Thornberry says we have an ontological crisis, he means we have a society that fundamentally disagrees on, or just flat out ignores what a human being actually is.
Interesting.
Right. Are we just highly evolved meat computers generating subjective preferences, or is there a specific objective nature to human beings that demands a certain kind of respect?
So an ontological truth would be something like, human beings possess inherent dignity, and that statement is as objectively true as gravity pulls objects toward the center of the earth.
Precisely that. It exists whether we vote for it, whether we believe in it, or whether we ignore it. Gravity doesn't care if you believe in it.
Right.
And flowing from that, Thornberry defines the good simply as alignment with what is objectively real alignment with genuine human flourishing based on our specific nature.
Which brings us to his definition of evil, which, I have to say, blew my mind a little bit.
It's a huge shift from how we normally think about it.
It is. He says evil is not a competing substance. It's not like there's a dark matter universe fighting a light matter universe. He defines evil as a privation, a deficiency.
Yeah, and this is a concept pulled straight from classical philosophy, specifically Augustine and Aquinas. To understand privation, think about cold and heat. Cold isn't a thing in itself. You can't, capture a jar of cold. Cold is simply the absence of heat. Or think of blindness. Blindness isn't an entity. It's the absence of sight in an organ that was originally designed to see.
Oh, that makes sense. I was thinking about it earlier, like rust on a car.
Oh, rust.
Yeah, because rust isn't a factory-installed feature. You don't build a car and say, let's add the rust module to the doors.
Right. No one orders the rust package.
Exactly. Rust is the corruption, the decay of the iron that is supposed to be there. It's a failure of the original material.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Evil is the rust. It is a distortion or an absence of proper order. It parasitically feeds on the good.
Wow.
And because of this specific ontological reality, Thornberry argues that human persons possess inherent dignity that exists prior to the existence of the state.
Okay, meaning the government didn't invent human rights, so the government inherently can't take them away.
Exactly. Constitutions do not grant us our dignity. They merely recognize it.
So the rights exist out there in reality.
Yeah.
And the document is just waving a hand saying, yes, we see them.
Exactly. And a constitution that fails to recognize this pre-existing dignity is fundamentally defective, no matter how elegantly it's written or how many millions of people voted for it.
Man, okay. So let's map this onto the pyramid itself. Thornberry calls this his three-layer constitutional architecture.
Right.
Let's start at layer one, the ontological foundation. This is the absolute bottom layer, the deep concrete footings. And the text is incredibly firm here. This layer is non-negotiable and non-democratic.
Completely outside the voting booth.
Exactly. This is where basic protections like the right not to be murdered, the right not to be enslaved, the right to bodily integrity exist, entirely insulated from electoral outcomes.
You cannot put layer one to a vote. It just isn't up for debate. Then, moving up the pyramid, we reach layer two, the moral cognitive participatory layer.
Okay, what happens there?
Think of this as the bridge between the bedrock and the actual society. It's about how human beings actually access, understand, and participate in that foundational truth. And Thornberry makes a huge concession to reality right here. He acknowledges that access to moral truth is incredibly uneven across any given population.
Which is just sociologically undeniable. We don't all have the same moral clarity.
We really don't.
Some people are deeply philosophical. They read Aquinas on the weekends. And some people Well, most people just want to grill burgers on a Sunday and not think about metaphysics at all.
It's the reality of human nature. Not everyone sees the truth clearly, either due to bad formation, cultural bias, or just a total lack of interest.
Right.
And finally, sitting at the very top of the structure is layer 3, the civic, political, operational layer. This is the visible part of the pyramid.
The part above ground.
Exactly. This is where the actual messy business of daily governance happens. It's the legislature passing a tax code, the city council zoning a neighborhood, the courts hearing a contract dispute over a broken fence.
So for the students of political theory listening right now, we have to contextualize where Thornberry's getting this architecture.
Yeah.
Because he didn't just invent it in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
He is explicitly building this on the natural law tradition of Thomas Aquinas. But, and this is fascinating, he is also setting up this framework by directly critiquing two massive modern thinkers, Jacques Maritain and Alasdair MacIntyre.
Yes.
And to really understand why this golden pyramid matters, we need to understand what Maritain and MacIntyre supposedly got wrong. So let's start with Maritain. Who was he and what was his mistake?
Well, Jacques Maritain was a towering figure in mid-20th century philosophy, and he was highly influential in the drafting of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights right after World War II.
Okay, so high stakes.
Incredibly high stakes. Maritain was faced with a massive practical problem. You have a post-war world completely traumatized by atrocities.
Holocaust, the bombings, everything.
Right. And you are dealing with diverse nations with entirely different religions, philosophies, and political systems. How on earth do you get them to agree on a single list of human rights?
Right. How do you get a secular humanist, a devout Muslim, an atheist communist, and a traditional Christian to all sign the exact same document?
It seems impossible. But Maritain's solution was what he called a practical charter. He believed that society could agree on shared moral conclusions like torture is bad or free speech is good, without having to agree on the metaphysical grounding of why those things are true.
It's like he walked into the room and said, look, everyone, we are never going to agree on whether God exists or what the ultimate structure of the universe is. So let's lower the bar. Let's just all agree not to kill each other. Let's write that down, sign it, and call it a day.
In academic terms, he essentially lowered the epistemic threshold to achieve public agreement.
Yeah.
He separated the practical rules from the foundational philosophy, and at the time, it felt like a massive triumph.
I mean, they got the Declaration signed.
They did. But Thornberry argues that history, over the last 80 years, has entirely refuted Maritain's approach. He says moral consensus without ontological grounding is a temporary inheritance.
Temporary inheritance. I have to say, that phrase is so evocative.
It explains so much about our current cultural moment. Imagine your grandparents were incredibly wealthy because they worked tirelessly to build a massive business. That's the deep philosophical grounding, the hard work.
Okay.
They leave you a massive inheritance. You can spend that money for a generation or two living lavishly without ever having to work or even understand how the money was made in the first place. But eventually, the inheritance runs out.
You spend the savings, but you don't know how to generate the capital yourself.
Exactly. Thornberry is arguing that over a few generations, the practical agreement Maritain celebrated just runs out because society severed the rules from the reality that gave them meaning.
Wow.
So when the younger generations ask, well, why shouldn't I do whatever I want? And the only answer society can give is, because we all agreed not to in 1948. Well, that's not strong enough. The consensus shatters. You end up with the shattering glass from our opening image.
Okay, so that's Maritain's failure, a temporary inheritance that ran dry. What about Alasdair MacIntyre? Thornberry says MacIntyre properly diagnosed the disease but didn't write the right prescription.
Right. MacIntyre wrote a seminal book in 1981 called After Virtue, which is basically the definitive text on this exact moral fragmentation we're talking about.
Okay.
He has this famous opening analogy where he imagines a world where a catastrophic anti-science movement destroys all scientific knowledge, just burns the labs, burns the books.
It's like a dystopian sci-fi setup.
Exactly. And years later, people find the surviving fragments, a piece of a telescope, a page from a physics textbook. They use the words gravity and electron, but they have completely lost the theoretical framework that makes those words mean anything.
They have the vocabulary, but they lost the grammar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
MacIntyre argued that this is exactly what happened to our moral language. We yell words like justice and rights at each other, but we've lost the underlying framework that gave them coherent meaning. So it just devolves into emotional shouting matches.
Which sounds exactly like scrolling through social media on any given Tuesday.
It really does. It's an incredibly accurate diagnosis. But MacIntyre's solution was, well, somewhat pessimistic on a national scale. He basically suggested that the only way forward was to retreat and rebuild small local communities of virtue little enclaves where the vocabulary and the grammar could be reunited.
To head to the hills and build a monastery, essentially.
Right. The Benedict option kind of thinking. But Thornberry says that is not a sufficient answer for the modern state. You can't just abandon the national project and rebuild local communities in the dark.
Right.
You need an actual scalable constitutional remedy to govern 300 million people in the meantime. You need the golden pyramid.
Okay, I am following the architecture, but I have to jump in here with a massive, glaring pushback. This is the alarm bell that's ringing in my head right now, and probably in the listener's head too.
Let's hear it. Lay it on me.
If layer one, the absolute bedrock foundation of this entire system, is strictly non-democratic and based on an objective truth that we are not allowed to vote on, doesn't that inherently threaten democracy?
That sounds like it, right?
Yeah. I mean, who gets to decide what that truth is? If the foundation is non-negotiable, aren't we just laying down the red carpet for a dictator or a philosopher king who claims they have the absolute truth and bypasses the voters entirely?
It is the most natural, vital objection to make. If truth is not subject to a vote, who enforces it? But Thornberry anticipates this, and to understand his defense, we have to completely flip how we view the relationship between truth and power.
Okay.
We have to go back to that core mechanic. Constitutions don't create rights, they recognize them.
Okay. Unpack that. How does that actually stop a dictator?
Well, if you make layer one subject to democratic vote, if you say that human rights are just whatever the majority decides they are on any given Tuesday, then human rights are merely majoritarian preferences.
Which is terrifying, because that means 51% of the population could legally, democratically vote to enslave the other 49%.
Yes. Or a charismatic leader could convince the majority to strip the rights of a minority.
And it would be perfectly legal, because the truth is whatever the 51% says it is.
Exactly. By removing the foundational layer from the democratic process, Thornberry is actually constructing the ultimate defense against tyranny. If there is no objective truth that restrains the majority, then the majority can do whatever it wants. Governance reduces to mere power.
So the non-democratic nature of layer one isn't a weapon for a dictator to use. It's the shield against the mob. It places basic goods entirely beyond the reach of the ballot box.
Exactly. It's a restriction on power, not a blank check for it. But your concern about dictatorship leads us directly into the most complex operational challenge of the whole white paper.
Which is?
If this framework is rooted in an objective, non-negotiable truth, how does it avoid becoming a theocracy?
Right. Because you're going to have millions of citizens who might fundamentally disagree with the specific ontological truth Thornberry is talking about. How do you govern a deeply pluralistic society without forcing everyone to convert to the exact same religion or philosophy?
And that brings us to the operational engine of the model. To handle this paradox of pluralism, Thornberry introduces what he calls the anti-theocracy principle.
The anti-theocracy principle. That sounds like a heavy firewall. What does it actually do?
It is the defining operational boundary of the entire system. It states that the state governs conduct in relation to objective goods, not belief in their metaphysical grounding.
It governs what you do, not what you believe.
Exactly. The state can force you to respect the basic goods, like it can force you not to murder someone, but it cannot force you to assent to the philosophical or theological account of why human life has dignity in the first place.
Interesting.
To make this actually work across a diverse population, Thornberry pulls out a concept from Thomas Aquinas called the doctrine of partial moral knowledge.
Okay, let's break this doctrine down. How does partial knowledge help us govern?
So Aquinas argued that moral knowledge isn't all or nothing. It breaks down into three distinct levels. First, you have the primary precepts.
Okay.
These are the deepest, most foundational instincts, and Aquinas says they are universally known to all rational agents. The core one is basically, do good, avoid evil. Thornberry argues these are virtually indestructible in a functioning human mind. You cannot be a rational person and not have some vague instinct that good is to be pursued.
Second, you have the secondary precepts.
Right. These are the immediate logical conclusions of the primary ones. Things like, do not murder, do not steal, honor your agreements. The text says these are nearly universal and can be legitimately enforced across a pluralistic population, even if that population doesn't agree on the deep metaphysics behind them.
And then third, you have the tertiary applications.
Exactly. These are the highly specific, complex legal norms and institutional arrangements. The tax code, zoning laws, environmental regulations. And this is where genuine, legitimate diversity of thought and disagreement happens. People will argue fiercely about tertiary applications.
To ground this for you, the listener, let's try an analogy. Let's imagine our civic life is driving on a massive, complex highway system.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
The primary precept, that indestructible baseline instinct, is basically don't crash the car.
Right.
Everyone, no matter their religion, background, or political party, gets on the highway with the primary instinct to survive the trip.
The desire for self-preservation and order is innate. Everyone gets that.
Then you have the secondary precepts. These are the universal traffic rules we can enforce on everyone, like stop at a red light or stay in your lane. Now, here's the key. You do not need to be an automotive engineer, and you don't need a PhD in civil engineering to understand why we have red lights. We can enforce the red light on the entire population without needing them to write a philosophical essay on the physics of momentum.
The enforcement is completely legitimate because the recognition of the immediate danger, the secondary precept, is shared.
Exactly. But then you get to the tertiary applications. This is the argument over, hey, should this particular intersection be a four-way stop? Or should we spend the tax money to build a roundabout? Or should the speed limit on this stretch of highway be 55 or 65 miles an hour?
And we can argue about that all day.
Right. We can have massive, legitimate, good faith disagreements about those tertiary issues without violating the primary precept of don't crash.
That is a brilliant way to map the structural reality of this framework. And what makes Thornberry's system so operationally viable is that you can successfully govern people who do not share your underlying philosophy because you are only relying on their secondary moral perception.
You don't demand full metaphysical agreement to enforce a red light.
You just need them to be capable drivers. Which leads directly to Thornberry's broader concept of hierarchical pluralism.
Now, this is a term that might make modern ears ring a bit. Hierarchical pluralism.
It does. He draws a very sharp, unapologetic distinction here. He says the framework tolerates persons who must always unconditionally be treated with dignity, but it does not affirm all positions as being equally aligned with reality.
And this is a major, deliberate departure from modern liberal relativism.
Yeah.
The current cultural ethos often tries to enforce the idea that all truth claims are equally valid, or, your truth is your truth.
Yeah, Thornberry says no. All people have equal dignity, absolutely, but ideas are not people.
Ideas are not people.
Exactly. Not all ideas are equally true. Some ideas are just wrong or actively destructive to human flourishing.
And to practically structure a society around this reality, he proposes 3 tiers of civic participation. Let's walk through these tiers because I know the word tiers might make some people instantly think of a rigid caste system, and we need to clarify why he argues it isn't one.
Let's break them down. Tier 1 consists of what he calls full participants. These are the citizens who actively recognize and affirm the foundational moral order.
Okay.
They don't just stop at the red light. They understand the civil engineering and the philosophy of why the light is there. In this framework, these are the people who are entrusted with stewardship over formative institutions. They lead schools. They guide religious communities. They are the primary architects of cultural formation.
Then you have Tier 2, the partial participants. According to the white paper, this is the vast majority of citizens. Going back to our analogy, these are the normal, everyday drivers.
Yep.
They stop at the red lights, they follow the laws, they pay their taxes, but they don't necessarily care about or affirm the deep philosophical architecture behind the rules.
But critically, and this is where the caste system fear is dismantled, Tier 2 participants have full civic standing. They can vote, they can hold civil office, they have full constitutional rights. The framework does not demand they become philosophers to be full participating citizens.
Yeah. And finally, Tier 3, the dissenting participants. These are people who explicitly and actively reject the foundational moral order. They might fundamentally disagree with the ontological reality Layer 1 is built on.
But again, this is vital. They retain all basic rights and human dignity. They are not exiled. They are not thrown in jail for their beliefs. They are tolerated. They are protected from violence. And they are engaged through persuasion.
So if they aren't punished, what's the difference? What's the catch for Tier 3?
The limitation is purely institutional. Tier 3 participants are not given institutional authority over the moral formation of others.
Okay, let's unpack why that is functional rather than oppressive. Thornberry makes the point that movement between these tiers is fluid and expected. People change their minds. And he argues that this tier system just formalizes what healthy institutions already do organically. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't hire a militant anti-medicine activist to train the new nursing recruits at the Red Cross, right?
Exactly. It's functional differentiation. You do not hand the stewardship of moral formation to someone who fundamentally disagrees with the moral order you are trying to form. It's not about punishing the dissenter. It's about protecting the integrity of the institution.
But this circles us right back to the anti-theocracy principle. Since the state can only govern outward conduct and cannot police inward belief, we have to draw a very sharp, legally binding line.
We need to know exactly what the law is allowed to force you to do and what absolutely must be left up to individual character.
And that brings us to the legal theory of limits. Thornberry points out that the defining error of every totalitarian regime in history is conflating external order with internal formation. Totalitarianism wants the state to control both your actions and your soul.
So he draws a strict boundary. Let's look at what the law can do. The law can protect basic goods. It can and should prohibit murder, theft, and fraud. It can order external conduct, it can enforce business contracts, protect private property, and regulate traffic.
And it can sustain the conditions for formative institutions to exist, like protecting the family unit.
But the list of what the law cannot do is where it gets really philosophically rich. The law cannot mandate interior assent. It cannot force you to truly internally believe something.
Because compelled virtue is just a performance. It's a hostage tape. Law cannot produce actual virtue.
Exactly. And this leads to a fascinating extrapolation in the text about the societal danger of proliferating law.
Proliferating law, what does that mean?
Thornberry argues that when a society loses its internal moral culture, when the families and communities stop forming virtuous people, the state panics. And the state tries to compensate for the loss of internal virtue by just creating more and more external laws.
It tries to micromanage behavior because people can't manage themselves.
Right. But when a society tries to govern itself entirely by multiplying regulations, when the volume of law expands in inverse proportion to the culture's actual formation, it creates a massive trap.
Oh, how so?
Because eventually, to enforce all those behavioral micro-regulations, you require a level of state surveillance and coercion that is completely incompatible with human dignity.
It's the old adage, you can't legislate morality. But taken to its structural, terrifying conclusion, if the people don't have internal virtue, the state eventually has to build a panopticon to force them to behave.
Exactly.
But let me push back on this boundary line.
Go for it.
If the whole purpose of a law is to protect a genuine human good, why not use the law to force people to be more charitable? Or use the law to force families to be loving to each other? Isn't forcing people to be better a net positive for society, even if it's a little coercive?
This goes right to the heart of Thornberry's distinction between blunt instruments and genuine freedom. Law is inherently a blunt instrument. It operates through the threat of violence or coercion. If you break the law, men with guns will eventually come to put you in a cage or take your money.
That is the grim reality of state power.
It is. So the law can prevent a father from physically exploiting or starving his child. That is the blunt instrument protecting a basic good. But the law absolutely cannot mandate the emotional quality of attentiveness, patience, or love within that family.
You can't issue a court subpoena for affection.
Precisely. Love, charity, genuine intellectual honesty. These require the oxygen of freedom. Virtue has to be freely chosen.
So if you force someone, it loses the virtue entirely.
Right. If you use the coercive power of the state to force someone to give away their money for a charitable cause, it ceases to be charity. It just becomes taxation. You cannot download virtue into a population through legislative enactment.
So to prevent the law from becoming this blunt, overreaching instrument that tries to engineer our interior lives, the framework proposes a gauntlet, 5 strict constitutional tests. Every single law passed by the legislature has to survive this obstacle course.
This is where Thornberry elevates the theory from philosophical abstraction to actual justiciable legal seriousness. These tests give judges concrete criteria to strike down totalitarian impulses on a Tuesday morning.
And the text explicitly notes these tests are cumulative, they aren't suggestions. If a law fails even one of these 5 tests, it is struck down as invalid. Period. Let's walk the listener through these hurdles using the real-world hypotheticals from the source material so you can see how they actually function.
Let's do it. Test 1 is the public expression test. This test governs the incredibly fraught line between protected disagreement and actionable civic disorder.
The standard here is that speech is legally protected unless it does one of three specific things: directly incites imminent violence, constitutes deliberate fraud causing tangible harm, or is an act of coercion itself.
To see this in action, imagine someone stands on a soapbox in the town square and publicly advocates for a philosophical position that the ordered liberty framework considers entirely mistaken. Let's say they are arguing that Layer 1 rights don't exist.
A completely contradictory idea.
Right. Even though they are advocating for a system that would violate basic goods, that speech is protected.
The state cannot arrest them for a bad idea. The state's only remedy is persuasion and debate.
Exactly. But if that same person on the soapbox uses their speech to point at a specific group of people and coordinate an imminent violent mob to attack them, that fails the test. That is no longer expression, it is coercion and violence. The speech is unprotected and the state can step in.
It's a very clear line. Okay, test 2 is the formation boundary test. This asks when the state is legally allowed to intervene in families or educational formation.
And the rule here is exceptionally strict. The state can only intervene if a basic Layer 1 good is actively being violated and if there is no less coercive remedy available.
For example, if Child Protective Services gets a call that a child is being physically abused or systematically starved in a home, that is a direct violation of the basic good of life and bodily integrity. The state can and absolutely must intervene.
But, and this is the massive barrier against progressive state overreach, the state cannot override parental authority just because a bureaucrat prefers a different curriculum or wishes the child was receiving a different ideological formation. Disagreement about formative content does not justify the blunt instrument of state intervention.
Which brings us to test 3, the conscience protection test. This is crucial for navigating our pluralistic highway. A law cannot require a person to actively participate in an act they deem intrinsically evil.
The primary example here is medical. The state can prohibit a surgeon from performing an unnecessary or harmful operation. That is just restricting an action.
Right.
But the state cannot force a surgeon to perform an abortion under legal penalty if that surgeon deeply believes it is the taking of innocent human life.
Because doing so would be commandeering their conscience. Let's dig into that, because commandeering is an interesting word. Why does forcing an action destroy the foundation?
Because if the state can force you to use your mind, your skills, and your physical body to perform an act you believe is fundamentally evil, the state has essentially claimed ownership over your rational agency. It reduces a human being to a mere tool of the state. And that violates the Layer 1 dignity we talked about at the very beginning.
That makes total sense. Test 4, the institutional integrity test. The state cannot colonize or assume the function of a formative institution without consent or an active violation of goods.
The white paper uses independent religious schools as the primary example here. The state cannot sweep in and mandate specific ideological or theological content inside private religious schools just for the sake of achieving civic consistency across the population.
The state cannot consume the independence of institutions that exist prior to it.
Exactly.
And finally, the last hurdle in the obstacle course, test 5, the accessible law test. This one goes all the way back to our Tier 2 normal everyday drivers. Laws must be recognizable as reasonable to a Tier 2 participant without requiring them to share the full philosophical agreement.
Banning murder easily passes this test. You do not need a PhD in Thomistic natural law to know that stabbing someone is wrong. The rationality is accessible to everyone.
But if a legislature tried to legally enforce complex, tertiary religious regulations, like legally mandating that all citizens must observe a specific religious fasting period that fails the accessibility test.
Right, because a normal Tier 2 driver would look at that and say, I have no idea why the state is making me do this.
If you connect this back to the bigger picture, you can really see how these 5 tests act as an operative, dynamic defense mechanism. Yeah. They box the state in on both sides.
I do. They block progressive overreach, which often tries to dictate formation and commandeer conscience. And they block theocratic overreach, which tries to enforce interior assent and complex religious rules on a pluralistic public.
It is a brilliantly designed cage for state power. And notice something fascinating here. Almost all of those tests are designed explicitly to protect institutions that exist outside the government. Families, churches, private schools, consciences.
Yeah.
Which leads us perfectly to the framework's ultimate conclusion about where a society is actually built.
And this introduces Thornberry's doctrine of formation. He argues that the state is not the builder of society, it is merely the security guard. Formation, the actual building of human beings, is the primary work of civilization. Law is just the picture frame. Formation is the painting inside it.
He makes a really stark, uncomfortable contrast here between genuine formation and mere indoctrination. And honestly, if you are an educator, a parent, or anyone who cares about the next generation, this part of the deep dive is vital to understand.
It's one of the most powerful sections of the paper. Indoctrination, Thornberry says, aims solely at producing compliant responders.
Compliant responders.
You're right. It bypasses a person's rational agency entirely. You train a child to repeat the correct political or social formulas. You train them to behave correctly when the teacher or the state is watching. But the moment they have true freedom, they revert to chaos.
Because they haven't internalized anything. It's behavior modification, not character development. Indoctrination creates immense moral fragility.
Exactly. But genuine formation is about developing rational agents who can actually make moral judgments and govern themselves. It's about preparing a human being to handle the terrifying weight of freedom properly.
And the white paper insists that this heavy, delicate lifting of formation simply cannot be done by the blunt instrument of the state bureaucracy. It relies entirely on 4 vital independent institutions. Let's look at them. First, the family.
The foundational unit.
Thornberry calls the family the irreplaceable primary institution of character formation. The authority of parents over their children isn't a temporary grant given by the government. It's a pre-political, natural reality.
Second is the church, or religious and philosophical communities. The paper argues that this is the institution ordered toward the ultimate ground of moral reality.
And Thornberry offers a very sharp warning here. A society that intentionally marginalizes religious or philosophical community causes moral amnesia.
Yes. The society forgets why the rules matter in the first place, leading us right back to that temporary inheritance problem.
Third is the school. And the school's specific job is the cultivation of rational capacity and honest reasoning. But critically, the school is structurally supplementary and accountable to the family. It is an extension of the family's authority, not a replacement for it.
And fourth, civic associations. This means the local community boards, the neighborhood watch, the local Rotary Club, the amateur sports leagues.
This is where citizens learn to practice responsible freedom outside the family unit, but beneath the massive level of the state.
This all ties into a massive philosophical principle called subsidiarity. Let's define subsidiarity for the listener.
Yeah, please do.
The rule of subsidiarity is beautifully simple. Decisions must be made at the lowest, most local level capable of making them. The family governs the child, the community governs the neighborhood, the city governs the local roads. The state only steps in to handle national or macro-level affairs that the lower levels genuinely cannot handle. Higher levels exist to support lower levels, never to absorb them.
And this completely reframes the definition of what a politician should be, or what Thornberry calls a true statesman. The statesman doesn't sit in an office and ask, how much power can the state gather to fix this problem?
No, the statesman asks, what conditions must the state maintain so that families and local communities have the space and resources to do their jobs?
He writes, authority is not the enemy of freedom. It's the structure that makes it possible.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to stop you there. I have to push back hard on this because it sounds idyllic in theory, but I want you to look out the window at the actual world we live in right now.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
We live in an era of massive, unprecedented cultural atomization. Think about your own street right now. Do you know your neighbors well enough to form a community board? Most people don't.
Yeah, that's true.
Civic associations are dying. Churches are shrinking rapidly. Families are fractured. So what happens when these local communities and families have already atrophied? When the institutions of formation are essentially bankrupt? Can the state step in then to fill the void and save the structure?
It is the most tragic question of the modern era, but Thornberry warns that this is the ultimate trap.
Really? Even when things are broken?
Even then, when the state expands into these intimate domains to help an atrophied culture, when the state tries to become the parent or the community, it doesn't just temporarily redistribute functions, it actually destroys the conditions under which those functions could ever be recovered.
Let me see if I have an analogy for this. It's like breaking your arm and the doctor puts a heavy plaster cast on it to help it heal.
Okay.
But then you just leave the cast on forever. Because the muscle isn't being used, it completely wastes away. The cast, which was supposed to be a temporary support, becomes the very reason the arm is permanently paralyzed.
That is exactly it. If the state takes over the role of the family or the local community, it ensures those institutions will never organically rebuild because their purpose has been outsourced to a massive, distant bureaucracy.
Well, let's assume we have a relatively healthy society. Let's say we have robust families, strong local communities, and careful statesmen who respect subsidiarity.
In an ideal world.
Right. In an ideal world, you are still going to have conflicts. Good faith, highly formed citizens are eventually going to clash over those tertiary moral applications we talked about earlier.
Should this be a roundabout or a four-way stop arguments?
Exactly. How does a truth-based system handle a fierce dispute that isn't cleanly resolved by existing law without just resorting to a pure power struggle of might makes right?
That brings us to our final operational puzzle. Thornberry provides a three-step process for handling these unsolvable contested cases. Let's walk through this using a hypothetical case extrapolated from the text.
Okay, let's imagine a scenario. A group of citizens is refusing to pay a specific portion of their tax obligation because they discover that tax is funding a new government program they view as morally unjust.
A classic clash of conscience versus state policy.
Exactly. How does the ordered liberty framework process this without tearing the society apart?
Step one is identify the precept level. The court or the legislature has to look at the dispute and ask, does this conflict involve a primary level good? For instance, is this a dispute about the state legalizing murder or slavery? Because if it is, the process stops immediately. No majority vote can authorize the violation of Layer 1.
But in our tax hypothetical, this isn't about murder. This is a secondary or tertiary issue. It's about tax policy and the prudential means to achieve a civic good. It doesn't violate the foundational ontological layer directly. So we survive step one and move to step two.
Step two is delineate with accessible reasoning. This is where the public debate happens, but there is a strict rule here. The argument cannot be made purely using sectarian theology.
Meaning, you can't just stand up in the legislature, hold up your specific religious text, and say, my book says this tax is bad, therefore we must strike it down.
Right, because of the anti-theocracy principle. You have to argue your case in accessible Tier 2 language. You have to use natural law argumentation that normal citizens can grasp. You have to appeal to recognizable moral realities, human flourishing, and basic goods. You have to convince the public using reason they can access.
And then, after the exhaustive debate, we reach step three, institutional determination with appellate review. The legislature holds a vote, or the judge bangs the gavel and makes a ruling. A determination is made to settle the dispute.
And here comes the pushback. I can see it.
You bet. Because after all this incredible, towering philosophical architecture, all this deep talk of objective truth and ontological reality, at step three, it still just comes down to a judge making a ruling or a legislature taking a majority vote. How is that mechanically any different from the messy relativism we have right now?
It's a fantastic question, and the nuance here is essential to the whole system. Yes, at the end of the day, a determination is made by a flawed human institution. But the framework emphasizes that this determination is strictly provisional. It is not a permanent, infallible settlement of truth with a capital T.
So it's essentially the best guess we have at this particular moment in time.
It is the best current institutional judgment. And because it is provisional, it remains deeply structurally accountable. It's accountable to the independent judiciary, it's accountable to electoral feedback in the next cycle, and ultimately it is accountable to civil disobedience if it gravely violates a foundational reality over time.
It's a slow accumulation of institutional judgment that is constantly, nervously checking itself against the Layer 1 bedrock.
Exactly. And Thornberry makes a striking, counterintuitive point here. The elimination of all disagreement is not a mark of a truth-committed society.
Oh, really?
The forced elimination of disagreement is the hallmark of totalitarianism. A free, truth-oriented society actually requires structural disagreement to continually refine its understanding of what is real.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath, step back, and look at the whole picture. We have covered a massive journey today.
We truly have. We've built an entire civilization in an hour.
We started down in the dark with the bedrock of ontological truth, establishing that human rights aren't just polite preferences, they are grounded in a reality. We navigated through the paradox of pluralism, showing how a diverse society can be governed across different belief systems using Aquinas's partial moral knowledge and the functional reality of hierarchical pluralism.
We established the strict boundaries of the state, running through that 5-test constitutional obstacle course to keep the law from becoming a blunt instrument of tyranny.
We empowered the institutions of formation, the family, the church, the neighborhood, to do the actual heavy lifting of building civic character. And finally, we looked at the three-step adjudication process for resolving those inevitable, messy human conflicts.
It is a full, meticulously engineered ecosystem. It is the blueprint designed to prevent the societal collapse depicted in that first terrifying image of the shattering glass.
It is the Golden Pyramid. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something for you to mull over when you look at your own neighborhood, your own schools, and your own government.
Let's hear it.
If Thornberry is right, if the law truly cannot produce virtue, and if the state must entirely rely on the family, the church, and the local community to form citizens who have the character to handle freedom, what is the tipping point?
That is the chilling question beneath the entire white paper.
If the institutions of formation entirely abdicate their roles, if families fracture beyond repair, if schools merely indoctrinate compliant responders, if our communities remain totally atomized and isolated, can any constitutional architecture, no matter how brilliantly engineered, survive a population that has completely lost its moral memory?